All right, it's 1 o'clock on Wednesday. I think it's Wednesday. Welcome to our next installment of the Interdisciplinary Conservation Seminar Series hosted by the Human Environment Systems Group at Boise State. My name is Matt Williamson. I've been your host this semester and will be your host for 2 more of the sessions after today. A few logistics before we get started. The session is being recorded, and the link to the email or the video, once I've cleaned it all up, will be sent to whatever email you used to register. You're welcome to share that with anyone who couldn't be with us here today. When you come in, you are likely to be muted, and because there are quite a few of you today, we're going to ask that you turn your cameras off during the actual presentation, just to sort of help the streaming be as seamless as possible. We'll hold questions until the end, but feel free to post them in the chat as they occur to you. I can deal with those towards the end. Once we get to the question section, if you could either raise your hand using the button in the participant list or just turn your camera on, that'll be a good way for me to know that you've got a question. You can check out the schedule and register for the last 2 webinars of the semester at the link you see here. And then lastly, as we're sort of coming into the end of the semester of what has probably been one of the longest semesters of all of our lives, between the various episodes of racial violence in the US, fires burning up most of the western part of the country, an election season that just doesn't seem to want to end, we recognize that everyone may be just a little bit tired and a little bit worn thin. We ask that you just be kind to yourself and to each other. And we're extremely glad that you were willing to join us here today. I'm also extremely fortunate to be able to introduce Dr. Kathy Zeller, who's our speaker today. Kathy's a research biologist with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. And as a spatial ecologist, her research integrates the fields of landscape ecology, wildlife biology, landscape genetics, and biostatistics. Kathy seeks to understand and quantify how patterns and processes of human-driven disturbance and climate change affect wildlife populations and large ecological networks. Kathy is particularly interested in modeling connectivity within and among protected areas and in providing spatial products and decision support tools that are useful to managers and stakeholders. Kathy obtained her BS from Tufts, her MS from the University of Montana, and her PhD from the University of Massachusetts, and she joins us from the hills outside of Missoula. Thanks, Kathy.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. It's really great to be here today. I'm excited to present some lessons that I've learned in terms of modeling connectivity and connectivity conservation in general. As Matt mentioned, I'm with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. We are an interagency research institute that focuses on the National Wilderness Preservation System. So that means we do research for all the agencies. We do research for National Park Service, BLM Forest Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service. So I've only been in this position for a few months. So most of the research that I'm going to present is research that I've done prior to starting this position. Okay, so I'm going to start out talking about why connectivity is important. So connectivity is all about combating habitat fragmentation, which is one of the primary causes of declines in global biodiversity worldwide. Fragmentation leads to the loss of populations and causes long-term changes to the structure and functioning of ecosystems. But if we can combat that fragmentation with corridors and connectivity, we can really help combat those negative effects, and it's been referred to as the safety net of nature. So a lot of my research is focused on wildlife in particular, and for wildlife, connectivity is important for a number of reasons. First, it allows for species to migrate. So there are all of these species that have evolved to have this life history strategy where they have to travel tens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers to maximize access to critical resources like breeding grounds and food resources, and connectivity will allow them to continue to make these long migrations. Connectivity is also important because it allows for species to shift their ranges in response to climate change. So there was a study in 2011 that showed in the Northern Hemisphere that species were shifting their ranges 11 miles further north every decade. So this is 3 times what was previously thought. So these species are really, really moving in response to climate change. And this was put in a spatial context by Josh Lawler and his colleagues, where they mapped out something like 3,000 species and their movements over time. And you can see how much movement is happening for these species to be able to track their climate envelopes in these changing climates. So connectivity will allow these species to make these movements. So zooming down a little bit further, connectivity is really important because it promotes the dispersal of individuals among populations. So this prevents the isolation of populations, the negative effects of having small populations, and it allows for colonization of previously uninhabited habitat patches. And with those movements can come the movement of genetics. So gene flow really helps maintain the genetic diversity of populations and prevents the negative effects of things like inbreeding and genetic drift. And because a lot of my current research is focused on protected areas, I think connectivity is really important for maintaining the functioning of protected areas across the United States. So there's this research by Travis Bolote and his colleagues in 2016, where he mapped out the core protected areas, which are in those black polygons, and then mapped out connectivity among those protected areas. So you can see how generally far apart these protected areas are in certain areas and how much connectivity or potential for connectivity there is among these protected areas. So I think to really allow for the protected area network to be the backbone of conservation in the US, I think we really need to be promoting connectivity among these protected areas. And this is especially important for species that require really large areas and have low reproductive rates, because they typically need more than a single protected area in order to sustain populations. So those protected areas really need to be connected by corridors. But this is a challenge, right? So if most of those corridors are outside of protected areas and outside of federal or even state lands, it means that they're traversing across private properties. And there are some mechanisms to promote conservation on private lands. There are things like conservation easements. There are also laws that restrict the clearing of vegetation around waterways and things like that. But there aren't really great landowner incentive programs in place for maintaining or restoring connectivity on private lands. Also, connectivity for certain species might be problematic for some landowners. Some landowners might not want those large predators on their lands, things like wolves and mountain lions and grizzly bears. That just might not sit well with some people, especially livestock owners. So this presents a social barrier to movement for these species, as well as an ecological barrier to movement. So we're going to stay here for a little bit and talk about some of these challenges and maybe how to address some of these challenges when trying to conserve corridors across private lands. And I'll talk about some of my work with the Jaguar Corridor Initiative. So this was many, many moons ago now when I worked for an organization called Panthera. They are a nonprofit that does cat conservation globally. And at the time, one of my main charges with them was to model connectivity for jaguars across their entire geographic range from Mexico to Argentina. So this upper right-hand map shows jaguar populations, important jaguar populations that have been identified as being really critical for conservation for jaguars. And for a long time, this was the conservation plan for jaguars across their range. But since then, folks have shown that jaguars are actually moving around quite a bit among these populations, and this has been reflected in their genetics. So there's not a lot of barriers that have been identified between these populations, and it's been shown that there's actually a really high degree of genetic exchange among these populations. So now the thinking is, okay, instead of just conserving these dark green polygons, we need to connect those polygons with corridors to really create a comprehensive conservation network for this species. So we went ahead and we did that. We modeled corridors, and those are in those lighter green polygons. So then the next step was to start thinking about on the ground conservation efforts, but we really wanted to be sure that the areas that we identified in this coarser scale range-wide exercise were actually functional for jaguars and their prey. And we ran up against that private land issue again here. So this was the study area that we used for this research. And we have, this is in Nicaragua, and there's Wawasha National Park to the north, Cerro Silva Forest Reserve to the south, and then that range-wide modeled corridor going from north to south in that light green polygon. But a lot of this area was across private lands. So when you think about sampling for wildlife, a lot of your typical systematic wildlife surveys, it's going to be tough to do that when you have to ask permission from dozens or more landowners. Maybe some landowners don't want to grant you access to their property, you know, for multiple site visits over multiple seasons. There's lots of barriers. And doing this for a single corridor might have been feasible, but you know, we're talking about doing this for many, many corridors across a large geographic range. So we really needed a way to be able to sample for jaguars and their prey in an efficient way across these private lands. So we came up with a method to do that using systematic interviews with local people. So landowners and other people that lived in these corridor areas. And we designed those interviews to collect data on jaguar and prey presence, which is what we really needed to validate these corridor areas. But we were also collecting more social science type data on the perceptions of jaguars, future development plans or threats to the corridor areas, and what were the main community organizations in the area. And so these last three will come into play in a few slides when we start talking about on the ground conservation in these areas. So we use the jaguar data and the prey data to estimate the probability of use across the corridor area. So this is in that same corridor area in Nicaragua. We have the protected area to the north and the south. And then I'm also showing our sampling grid where we conducted multiple interviews with local people. And the darker the color simply means the higher probability of use for these species. And the way that we identified a corridor was to take any grid cell that had a jaguar sighting in the last year and had a 60% probability of use for 4 of the small prey species and 1 of the larger prey species. And with that information, we were able to shade in the grid cells that met those criteria. And then we identified the corridor as the area of cells that were contiguous from one protected area to the other. And then from some of the interview data, we were also able to identify the location of threats in the area. So there's some depredation that's happening in the eastern part of this corridor. There's some oil palm plantations planned for the southern part, and then there's some road building across the middle part of that corridor. So this method was greatly improved upon by my colleague at Panthera, Lisanne Petraka. What she did was she used a Bayesian hierarchical model to model occupancy for jaguars and their prey. And that model really accounts for some issues with interview data, such as false presences and false absences. And she worked with a lot of Panthera country teams to actually be able to do these interviews and apply this methodology across every single corridor in Central America. So we're going to shift focus a little bit now and go from Nicaragua south to Costa Rica to this corridor. It's called the Barbilla d'Estera corridor area. And this corridor is highlighted in the thick orange line, and it's connecting the southern jaguar population down here with the northern population up here. And there's some forest reserves in here. There's an indigenous territory and lots of private land in the middle. So our next challenge was, okay, how do we try and get some corridor conservation happening in this area? And we really embraced this quote by Jody Hilty from her Corridor Ecology book in 2006, where she says, "The most successful projects have strong collaborative relationships at all scales of governance and across interest groups. And building those relationships is necessary to any planning process and will increase the understanding of the human and natural systems." So what she's really saying here is, you need to work across all stakeholders in an area in order to see conservation success in corridor areas, and really bringing in that human aspect will help with conservation success in corridor areas. Um, so we ended up doing that. We worked at levels from the highest national level all the way down to the local landowner level. And I'll go through each one of those and the approaches we used for this corridor area. So Costa Rica is really unique in that they actually have a national program of biological corridors. Most countries only have, sort of protected area programs and don't really acknowledge biological corridors. Luckily, Costa Rica does, so it made this process a little bit easier in this one corridor area. And we presented them with the corridor. We explained its importance. We had maps and other data to support the incorporation of this corridor into their national program. And then once they accepted it into their program, it really eased working relationships with other departments and ministries in Costa Rica. This recognition also might help prevent future threats to the corridor. And Costa Rica also has a payment for environmental services program where landowners can be paid for maintaining forest on their properties. And being part of a corridor prioritizes those landowners for this payment for environmental services program. So that was another important reason to get this corridor recognized at the national level. So going down one other level is local governments. So this is where most land use planning and zoning takes place. So we worked with the municipality of Securias, which is the municipality that covered most of the corridor area. And Panthera is continuing to work with them to try and direct land use planning and zoning to really maintain and enhance connectivity across this corridor area. There's also autonomous indigenous territory in this corridor area. So they have autonomy over their lands and can implement their own land use planning and zoning. So Panthera is also continuing to work with them to maintain connectivity across this corridor. Going down another level, work with NGOs and universities has really been a key piece for conservation in this corridor. So instead of recreating the wheel and trying to get conservation programs off the ground in this area, we realized that there were already a lot of local, national, and international NGOs working in this area. So by combining resources, we were able to do a lot more than each of us working separately for conservation in this area. Also getting universities involved really helped increase resources for local student research and gets local students really involved in the corridor area. So we had local students doing a lot of wildlife surveys in the corridor area and documenting wildlife in the corridor and monitoring the corridor for changes in wildlife use. I also put large companies in here because they tend to be one of the largest landowners in corridor areas. So especially in Central America, there are a lot of large palm oil plantations, and they typically have an ecologist or a biologist on staff that tend to be receptive to ideas like increasing vegetation in the undergrowth that might promote movement of wildlife through certain parts of the palm oil plantation that can really enhance connectivity in a corridor. In this particular corridor in Costa Rica, when we were doing the surveys, this reservoir on the map here, this didn't exist, but we heard about plans for building a hydroelectric dam and having this whole area of the corridor be flooded, which we thought, oh man, this is really gonna impede connectivity for a lot of wildlife species. It's gonna be hard for them to get across the corridor in this area. But one of the positive outcomes of this was that this company had to do mitigation for the lands it was flooding with their reservoir. So Panthera has worked with them to actually identify parcels of land for acquisition, for forest restoration, to really increase connectivity across the backside of the reservoir, and still, despite the reservoir, maintain connectivity across this area. And then last, but definitely not least, are engaging with local landowners and community organizations. So as I mentioned in previous slides from our interview data, we're able to get to know people that lived in the corridor. We're able to get to know people in the community, and learn about things like farmers associations, tourism companies, community development groups, and things like that. And that really had us poised to be able to reach out to these people and invite them to these corridor committee meetings. So Panthera established holding a meeting about once a month, and inviting anyone in the local area that wanted to come. And one of the first meetings would be all about threats assessment. So asking local people, what they thought was threatening to their area. And the focus here was really taken away from wildlife in the area. It wasn't really focused on jaguars and their prey. It was just getting a sense from the people that live there what they want to see going forward into the future for the lands that they live in. And they identified a lot of threats like poaching of wildlife, road building, depredation. They mentioned the dam. And they also identified opportunities. So another meeting would be held to identify opportunities in the corridor area. So opportunities included increased tourism opportunities. If it's designated as a corridor and as maybe a Jaguar corridor, that might increase tourism for things like Jaguar viewing. There's also some interest in increasing ecotourism in the area in coordination with that indigenous community. Other opportunities were identified in terms of getting students involved to monitor the corridor area and incorporating educational programs in the local schools. And from all of that information, an action plan can then be developed for the corridor. And again, Panthera really took a backseat once these corridor committees started to form and get off the ground, and local people started to take charge. And that's really what the end goal of this was. It was to have the local people take ownership of this and carry it forward, because otherwise corridor conservation in this area would not have worked. So I just want to highlight some interesting outcomes of this. One is that they designed this logo for the corridor, which I think is really neat. The tops of the trees are supposed to be emblematic of the protected areas, and then they have the people holding up the corridor for wildlife traversing between those protected areas. And they have this logo on signs throughout the corridor area, so people know when they're entering this corridor. There's some pride in living in the corridor area. Also, tourism companies have really embraced this corridor committee and have provided funding for a lot of their work. There's been an environmental education program targeted at local schools that introduces students to the corridor area and wildlife in the area and the ecology of the area, with lots of really fun activities. And one of my favorite stories has to do with the dairy farmers in the area. So as I mentioned in the first couple of meetings, some of the threats that were mentioned were depredation of livestock. And these farmers were saying, sometimes they felt like the only option they had to retaliate was to kill jaguars and mountain lions in the area. But Panthera has our rancher outreach and mitigation program that was able to work with these farmers to help them manage their herds in such a way that would reduce the incidence of depredation on their livestock, and also increase the health of their herds to increase yields. And just the simple act of these farmers coming together and talking with one another, they realized that they were competing against each other for pricing. They realized that they were all having some of the similar issues, like getting their product to market. And so they actually formed their own dairy cooperative out of coming to these corridor committee meetings. So now they all work together to set prices. They work together to get their product to market. And the depredation has decreased, which means jaguars and mountain lions and other predators can probably move a little bit more safely across the corridor now. So this took a ton of work and a ton of time from a lot of different people. And I don't even have, the names of the local landowners or community groups on here. But it took a lot of volunteer hours and commitment from people. And this is for a corridor area it's a little bit less than 300 square kilometers. So not a very big area. And because you're dealing with all of these different landowners, different land tenures, it just takes a lot more work to get conservation done on these landscapes. The other issue here is that what worked in this one corridor might not work in another corridor, because each corridor is going to be really different in terms of what's going on in the corridor in terms of threats and opportunities, and even just the perceptions of the local people that live there in terms of jaguars and wildlife and things like that. So if you'll notice, we went from defining an ecological network based on jaguars and their prey to really focusing on a social ecological network, really bringing people in and really getting their input in terms of being able to promote connectivity across this corridor area and conserve this corridor. So I'm not a social scientist at all, so I'm going to stop there talking about social ecological networks, and we're going to go back to focusing on this piece of the puzzle here, the ecological network. I've spent a good 10 plus years now taking a look at this piece to make sure that we're quote unquote getting corridors right. And I think that's really important for two main reasons. One is that we don't want a misallocation of conservation resources, right? We don't want to do what we did here. So let's say, this was our modeled corridor, this light gray area going between the two protected areas in Nicaragua. And this is what we found to be the better area for connectivity for jaguars and their prey. If we didn't validate this corridor and we focused all of our efforts here, we might not have been focusing our efforts on the best places for our species of interest in the area. And conservation resources are so scarce and so hard to come by, we really don't want to be making those mistakes. And the second main reason is that, we really want to be gaining the trust of people. Scientists and science isn't trusted as much as it used to be. And so being able to get these corridor areas right, or get them as good as we can in terms of how they reflect movement for wildlife and wildlife species, I think is really, really important. So at the time when the study came out, most people were using sort of these out of the box, black box methods to model connectivity, and then not really doing the field validation piece. And that had me really concerned about corridor conservation going forward. So that really motivated me to go back to school to get my PhD and really evaluate the different methods that we're using to model connectivity for wildlife species, to try and see if we could get at some best practices for corridor modeling. So most of this work was done with mountain lions in Southern California on the Santa Ana Puma population. And we have the Santa Ana Mountains here. They're right between LA and San Diego. And we also have the Eastern Peninsula Range here, which I just want to point out because it'll become important in a couple slides. So these pumas live mostly in the rugged mountainous terrain. This is mostly a coastal sage scrub chaparral type habitat, surrounded by typical Southern California development. So lots of roads, lots of houses. And not surprisingly, because this mountain lion population is surrounded by a lot of people, their survival rate is pretty low. So they have an annual adult survival rate of about 56%. And this is in a population that's not hunted. So California doesn't allow any hunting of mountain lions in the state. So all of this mortality is coming from things like vehicle collisions, depredation permits, poisoning, essentially negative interactions with humans. And the other thing that's going on with this mountain lion population is that they're a pretty small population. And because of all the development surrounding this population, they're fairly isolated. So this study came out that showed that this is a fairly inbred population, and they're showing these classic signs of inbreeding like kinked tails and non-descended testes. But there was some hope for this population, and that lay in this cat that's called M86. So M86 was the only cat in the last 15 years that had been shown to travel into the Santa Ana population and successfully breed and pass on its genetic material to subsequent generations. And this study by Kyle Gustafson and his co-authors showed that this actually really enhanced the genetic diversity of this population and made the Santa Ana population look genetically much more similar to the Eastern Peninsula range, and it significantly decreased inbreeding for this population. So M86 was able to breed with F61 and F89 and F133 and have a bunch of offspring. Because the population is so small, M86 also ended up breeding with his offspring F92, and they had another litter. So things were looking pretty good. But then remember that really low annual adult survival rate. M86 and all of his offspring are no longer in this population anymore. There were a lot of vehicle collisions. There were some depredation permits. There were some cats that were not sure of their fates, but are pretty sure that they're not in this population anymore. So unfortunately, we're back to square one with this population, a fairly inbred population of cats. So not surprisingly, there's a lot of focus trying to increase connectivity in and out of this population. And I have these red no circles to the north and the east of the population because for many years, it was what movement research was happening in these areas, and it was found that these areas aren't really good areas for connectivity for wildlife. So the last hope for this population really lays in this area, which is kind of the shortest distance between the Santa Ana Mountains and the Eastern Peninsula Range. So that makes sense. But it has this 8-lane highway going through it with traffic on it 24 hours a day. So mountain lions and some prey have gotten killed by cars on this road. It's definitely a problem in terms of connectivity for this population of pumas. So we wanted to model connectivity. We wanted to model landscape connectivity to identify parcels of land on each side of this highway that would help maintain or maybe increase connectivity for these cats. And we also wanted to identify points along I-15 where road crossing structures might be built, maybe a road overpass or an underpass specifically designed for wildlife. But as we learned from Jaguars, we didn't want to just grab any connectivity model off the shelf and call it good. So we wanted to really examine a whole bunch of different approaches for modeling connectivity, a whole bunch of different connectivity models, and see if we could come up with the best model that we possibly could for pumas in this area. So what we do when we model connectivity is it's a pretty long process. One of the first steps that you do is you define your landscape between the populations that you want to connect. So say you want to connect population A to population B, and let's say you have a forest dependent species. You want to collect geospatial data that you think will affect movement and habitat use for that species. So let's say we just use a land cover layer here where these green pixels are forest and the gray pixels are agriculture. The next thing you do is collect biological data. So a whole bunch of different biological data types can be used to model connectivity, everything from telemetry data to genetic data. So this is a scat detector dog in Bhutan sniffing out tiger scat, camera trap data, community science data, a whole bunch of different options here. And then what's typically done is you combine your geospatial data and your biological data into a habitat selection function or a resource selection function. And from those models, you can predict probability of use or probability of movement across your landscape. So those forested pixels become a high probability of movement and the agriculture a low probability. And then what's typically done is you convert that into what's called a resistance surface or a cost surface, basically reflecting how resistant or costly each pixel is for movement for your species of interest. So those high probability of use pixels get a low resistance, and the low probability of use pixels a high resistance. And then once you have that, then you can finally go ahead and apply a connectivity model and identify your corridor between your two populations. So this is a fairly long chain of events, and there's all sorts of decisions that we're making as researchers that we may be unwittingly biasing our results and our connectivity models. There might just be different choices that you make along the way that can result in a better connectivity model for your species. So we wanted to look at a lot of these boxes along this flow chart here. But we started with the geospatial data. And what we did there was we wanted to define our landscape a whole bunch of different ways for mountain lions in Southern California. So we selected 7 different GIS layers that we knew affected mountain lion habitat use and movement. And then we selected a whole bunch of different spatial resolutions for those layers and thematic resolutions for those layers, and put them together a whole bunch of different ways. So we had 2,500 different landscape definitions that we examined in this paper, and we wanted to know how sensitive are resource selection and connectivity models to simply that geospatial data side of things, how you're defining your landscape. And then we went ahead and we developed those models. We modeled connectivity across the landscape. So in this figure, the dark gray polygons are protected areas. The line going from north to south is that I-15, that 8-lane highway. The background is a circuitscape connectivity model that's showing current density or flow. And then the black dots are areas along I-15 that have the highest values of current density or flow. So these would presumably be areas where you might consider building a road crossing structure for wildlife. And we have our best model on the upper left-hand side of this panel. And then we have our 25th percentile model all the way to our very worst model on the lower right-hand side of the panel, our 25th, 100th model. And you can see that the location of those points differ, those connectivity surfaces differ. And simply using the same exact model, but defining your landscape in different ways can have really large consequences in terms of modeling habitat use and connectivity. So yeah, we concluded that resource use models, connectivity algorithms are extremely sensitive to defining your landscape. It was driven a lot by spatial grain. So we looked at spatial grains from 30 meters to 240 meters, and we found that the finer spatial grain definitely improved model performance by a lot. We also found the number of geospatial layers was really important. So models that had 6 or 7 of those geospatial layers that we chose perform much better than models that had fewer layers. So this simply means that those models just had more explanatory power with more of those layers. And we really concluded that when you're doing a connectivity model, that you should examine multiple landscape definitions to identify the most appropriate landscape definition for your species and study area. Okay, so then we wanted to look at the biological data side of things. Which biological data type might give us the best connectivity model in the end? But each biological data type requires a slightly different resource selection function, which results in a slightly different resistance surface. And then we also wanted to look at the connectivity models. So we looked at 4 different biological data types. We had telemetry points from cats that were collared over about a 15-year period. We also had cats that had really high frequency collars. So they had fixed rates of anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And then from that, we were able to identify telemetry paths for these cats. We also had about over 100 genetic samples for our study area, and then a whole bunch of detection data taken from natural history museums. So what we did was we combined those data with environmental variables defined a whole bunch of different ways, and then came up with our resource selection functions. So for the telemetry points, we used point selection functions. And we did that in two ways. We used all points, and then we also analyzed the collar data to parse out different behavioral states, and then selected only the points from when a puma was in a movement state. So the thinking there is that maybe connectivity is better represented from when animals are moving through the landscape than in daybed locations or utilizing resources in other ways. For the path, to the telemetry paths, we used a path selection function, the genetic data, a landscape genetic model, and then the detection data, we applied 6 different species distribution models and an ensemble model to come up with our resistance surfaces for each one of those data types. And then we used 2 different connectivity algorithms to model connectivity across those resistance surfaces, both the cost distance and the circuit theory algorithm. And then we evaluated those models using the dispersal paths of pumas. This is from an independent data set. And what we did was we modeled both cost distance and circuit theory connectivity between the start and the end point of each dispersal path. And then what we did was we calculated the proportion of dispersal points on the top 10% of connectivity values for a connectivity model. So the thinking there was we wanted to do this in more of an applied framework where you're not typically presenting managers or land use planners with these wall-to-wall connectivity surfaces. You're typically restricting those surfaces at some upper percentile to derive a corridor from those areas. And then we just calculated the proportion of points along a cast dispersal path that fell within one of those corridors. And these are the results. So we have that proportion of points on the y-axis. The higher the proportion, the better the model. And then we have the 2 panels, our circuit theory and cost distance panel. So these are the means and standard errors of our species distribution models. These are the point selection functions. This is the path selection function. And this is the landscape genetic model. So we were actually fairly pleased that most of these data types and approaches perform fairly well, capturing over 60% of the dispersal points in that final corridor. But it's pretty evident that using a cost distance algorithm with the telemetry data really resulted in the best connectivity models for pumas in this landscape. Okay, so what have we learned so far? We've learned that geospatial data matters and that we should be exploring multiple layers and landscape definitions for any connectivity study. We also, again, we're pretty pleased that most biological data types perform relatively well, but if you do have access to GPS telemetry data, that seem to outperform the other data types. And then we were recommending the cost distance or resistant kernel connectivity algorithm. The way we modeled the cost distance, it was akin to using resistant kernels. So we're promoting that as the connectivity algorithm of choice. And so we took all those lessons learned and we came up with our conservation plan for pumas in this area. We identified habitat patches and corridors and locations along I-15 that might be good sites for siting one of those overpasses or underpasses. And this information is being used by San Diego and Riverside counties in their conservation planning. And it's also being used by Caltrans, again, to do feasibility studies for one of those wildlife crossing structures. Okay, I'm going to wrap up by talking briefly about black bears. And I just wanted to include this because a lot of my thinking on connectivity modeling has changed since working with these guys. For the jaguars and the mountain lions, we were modeling connectivity in a really static environment, right? It was just a single connectivity model for those species, basically from a single point in time. For mountain lions, that mostly made sense in our study area. There were studies showing that there's not a lot of seasonality for mountain lions. Their prey doesn't migrate. So maybe an annual model is fine for those species. But with black bears, it was a totally different story. So I worked with black bear data in Massachusetts, and all of the little red dots on this map are the telemetry locations we had. And black bears have a lot of dynamism going on in their response to landscape features. So this bear might respond to this landscape differently in the spring than it does during the summer or the fall. This same bear might have completely different responses to these landscapes during the daytime than at nighttime. There's also going to be differences among individual bears. And then, the trick becomes, how do you get a population level response out of all of these dynamic processes happening across all of these individuals? And then to complicate this process a little bit further, you have other land use change happening, like human development and climate change. So we tried to get at some of this by developing dynamic resistance surfaces, and really taking a look at how black bears were responding to the landscape during those different seasons, spring, summer, and fall, and for 2 different times of day, day and night. And I'm just going to zoom into a small part of Massachusetts to illustrate how things are changing for these bears for each one of these time steps. If you're familiar with Massachusetts at all, this development area down here is the city of Greenfield. The blue line is the Connecticut River going north to south with a lot of agriculture on either side. We also have some forested areas and roads. So we came up with resistant surfaces for spring day, and in all of these, resistance is going to be higher in the brown colors and lower in the blue colors. And I just want to roll through these and see how this changes, right? So going from spring day to spring night, there's quite a bit of change happening on the landscape. Going to summer day, there's changes happening again and again. And as I move into fall, I want you to keep an eye on this agricultural valley. Crops become more ripe in the fall. Bears take advantage of that supplemental food resource. So that high resistant area gets less resistant when you're looking at fall day, and then even less resistant when you're looking at fall night. So you can see how things are changing so much just going from day to night, from season to season. So how do we really capture that in terms of connectivity? And I'm just going to show this in terms of identifying road crossing locations again. This is that same part of Massachusetts. Here's Interstate 91 going from north to south, and State Route 2 going from east to west. So we ran connectivity models for each season and time of day. And I've just put these red boxes here showing areas of highest connectivity across the roadway. Again, places where you'd presumably look to maybe build a wildlife crossing structure. So you can see how these crossings just change over time. And then the challenge becomes, do we give managers 15 different maps with these different results on them? Or how do we summarize this for actual management on the landscape? So there's a few different ideas here. You can use all of them, just identify all road crossing locations. For bears, we know that they tend to cross roads and use areas of human development more at night than during the day. So maybe it might make sense to just use all the nighttime locations. Or maybe you just want to be really sure and use those locations that are consistent regardless of season or time of day. So you use those locations that are the same across all of those models. And then, of course, we have future development. So we use data from the Designing Sustainable Landscapes projects that projected human development over 10-year time steps. And we incorporated those into our resistant surfaces and identified those road crossing locations again. And I'm just going to roll through here. We lose a couple locations as we go through time. We lose a couple more as we go through time, but gain one. Things keep changing until our last time step. But these are the areas of persistent connectivity. So areas that are resilient to human development going into the future. And this work was summarized in this paper published in Animal Conservation earlier this year. And all of this got me and some co-authors thinking about dynamic landscape connectivity and, when is it important to incorporate dynamism into connectivity models? How do you translate that and all of that uncertainty to working with managers and incorporating on the ground conservation efforts? So this was kind of a thought piece on all of that. So if you're interested in dynamic connectivity models, I encourage you to check that out. I kind of went through the best practices that we found for our species, which were really generalist species. So mountain lions in Southern California, black bears, but we really need more corridor validation efforts with different species in different study areas to see if we can come up with generalized best practices for modeling connectivity across species and study areas. I think that's a huge opportunity for future research. Also, how much does dynamism matter? How much do you want to incorporate that into your connectivity models? How do you distill all that information for managers? And then, how do we get a little more sophisticated at modeling connectivity? How do we incorporate density dependent processes, things like territoriality, the presence of other species, and demographic information? The rubber really hits the road for species, talking about survival rates and fertility and genetics. And so how do we incorporate that information into connectivity models as well to be able to really provide more information on how connectivity can help population dynamics? And then finally, better ways to incorporate that human aspect of those landscapes between protected areas. So how do we incorporate areas where there might be social barriers to connectivity for species, conflict with humans, and mortality hotspots? So with that, I just want to acknowledge my many amazing collaborators from throughout the years, our funders, and I just wanted to thanks again to Dr. Williamson for inviting me to give this seminar. And I love talking about all of these topics, so feel free to reach out. I've included my email there, and you can find me on Twitter as well. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and take some questions if there's time.
Thank you. We do have some time for questions. Looks like there's one already in the chat. And that is cost, distance, or resistance kernel recommended in general, or just recommended for that each connectivity model approach be evaluated based on the species and the amount of desired dynamism? Well, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, like I said, we were really only able to do this full factorial model comparison process for mountain lions and a little bit for black bears. So I really don't have an answer to that. For some of my other work, I actually found that circuit theory performed better for identifying specific road crossing locations. So I think there's a lot more we have to do in terms of figuring out which algorithm and which connectivity approach is appropriate for certain questions. And does that hold across all species and all study areas? So I don't have an answer. It's a huge area for future research.
There's another question in the chat from Peter Morrison. Do you have information on how successful the corridors, for example, for jaguars, have been in terms of their actual populations?
That's a great question. I'm not involved in that project much anymore, but I do know that they are actively using scat detection dogs to collect scat to be able to get genetic data and see how well connected these populations and maybe get some other demographic information out of that. So stay tuned. I'm sure we'll be seeing some publications from Panthera on that in the near future.
Now there's a question from Ray asking what were the primary sources of poisons affecting mountain lions, and whether the sort of lead poisoning issues that show up for condors are also showing up for cats.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure about the lead poisoning. One of the main issues with mountain lions and other predators in Southern California is the amount of rodenticide that's being used by folks just trying to control mice and rats around their homes. And that really bioaccumulates up the food chain. And it's thought to lead to mange and other negative health consequences of cats, although that link, there still needs to be some more study there. But that's really the main poisoning. Although I heard that I think California outlawed those rodenticides in particular. So hopefully that situation will improve in the future.
I'm going to have a hard time keeping up with all these. So one from Kate. Did jaguars have legal protections in the areas you were working in? And did the local governments provide any sort of compensation for depredation events? And if so, does that actually help affect local perceptions, or was the sort of compensation independent of people's reactions to the animal?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. In Costa Rica, it was illegal to kill jaguars. Jaguars are mostly protected in a lot of their range. They're threatened on the IUCN Red List. So in terms of compensation, it's really on a country by country basis. And I'd have to defer to other folks that know more about rancher and jaguar conflicts to answer the question about whether those compensation programs are working or changing attitudes at all.
I'm just going down the list. I feel like I can't, there's so many coming in, I can't string them all together. Any recommended literature for incorporating actual mortality into connectivity models in terms of developing the resistance layer? So, you know, typically we might think about it in terms of resistance to movement. I think Fletcher's group has been thinking about actually incorporating the likelihood of death, not just the difficulty of movement. Have you started thinking about how to incorporate some of those? I think there are roadkill data sets and things like that that can sort of speak to those pieces.
Yeah, definitely. So Rob Fletcher's group, he's come out with a software package to model connectivity that takes survival, I believe, into account. So that would be one thing to look at. I think that paper was published earlier this year. And yeah, I think they're having a couple other papers too that have tried to incorporate mortality into the resistance surface in order to model connectivity. I think mostly what's been done to date, though, is that it's just sort of assumed that certain cover types or areas of human development will have a higher risk for passage for these species, but explicitly getting at those survival or mortality rates, I think is pretty difficult, especially because you're usually modeling connectivity across areas where there aren't really established populations of species where you can really collect that kind of data. So a lot of it is kind of a leap of faith, but I think it's a leap that we should be trying to make and trying to figure out.
So we have about 2 minutes left, and I guess I would like to ask, given I'm going to put you on the spot because I know this is a relatively new position, but I wonder what opportunities you see working at kind of an interagency research institute for developing a more coherent approach to connectivity conservation in the US. So what are we have a national park system, we have a national monument system, we don't have a national corridor system like the one in Costa Rica. What do the prospects for that look like in the US, and how do you see your role at the Wilderness Institute sort of working towards those sorts of objectives?
Yeah, so you know, I can't promote any policy or anything in my position, but there is a bill that's been introduced called, I believe it's the National Wildlife Corridors Act. And the purpose of that bill is to actually try and get the different agencies to talk to each other and think about connectivity and incorporate connectivity on their lands. So that's one thing that might be coming up in the future. Another thing is, you know, the Forest Service, a lot of forests have a mandate to incorporate climate change and connectivity into their forest plans. I think there's a large need for more connectivity models in order to allow managers to be able to have some spatial data to do that and identify areas for connectivity. And I also think, being able to determine how protected areas and wilderness areas act as kind of the cornerstones of ecological networks and their importance, not only today, but going into the future. I think that's really important to be able to demonstrate the importance of those things for general ecological health as well as specific wildlife species.
Sorry, I forgot you can't actually talk about that now as a federal government employee. We have hit the 2 o'clock mark. For the graduate students enrolled in the HES seminar here at Boise State, if you didn't get your questions answered today, please post them in the Slack channel. Kathy will be around for the rest of the week. For the rest of you, if you have any questions about how to get in touch with Kathy, I'm happy to pass her email on to you. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. Please join us again, not next week, but the week after. It's American Thanksgiving for all of our Canadian friends here, so we won't be having a seminar next week, but we'll be back the first week of December. You're welcome to join us. Please do. Have a great rest of your Wednesdays.